Welcome, everyone. Just a gentle reminder to everyone that if you do not agree to your image being captured in the recording, or otherwise, if you should make any remarks, for your remarks to be similarly captured, then we encourage you or advise you to switch off your camera. And should you have any questions at all, you're welcome to put that in the chat itself. Otherwise, very happy to welcome everyone to this book talk. Very happy to see familiar faces as well. Edward, Danny, hello, good seeing you. You would have seen the illustrious profile of Professor Alex London, whose work we are featuring today. We are also very privileged to have two commentators, Professor Nancy Jecker and Dr. Robert Steele, who is with us here. Let me first introduce Professor London. Professor London is a wonderful colleague in the field of bioethics. Look at you. Well, I think his illustrious record needs no further elaboration. It's very clear from what we have sent around. I'd like to say that personally, he is one of the best minds I've encountered. So we are very fortunate to have him speak to us about his most recent publication, For the Common Good. You know that this book, published by Oxford University Press, is available, open access. We have sent the link around. You're welcome to have a look at that if you haven't already. Given the richness of the discussion in the publication, we won't clearly be able to deal with all of these aspects. We thought that it would be wonderful to hear Professor London speak generally about his work, and then, of course, to focus in particular on part 3. Of course, that speaks to the global aspect. But as far as the commentators are concerned, of course, we've invited them to be quite free in commenting on any aspect that they find pertinent. For all of our participants, if you have any questions at all, please do feel free to raise them. It will be an opportunity to hear directly from Professor London. So with this, Professor London, it is over to you.
Okay, well, first of all, good morning and good evening to everybody. Thank you for coming. Also, thanks very much, Calvin, for that super generous introduction. That means quite a bit coming from you, so I really appreciate that. Thanks also to the University of Hong Kong Center for Medical Ethics and Law for hosting the session, and just in advance to Drs. Jecker and Steele for taking the time to read the book and comment on it. It's really an honor to have them dedicate their time to talking about the book. So let me share my screen. So what I want to do in the brief 20 minutes that I have is just give you an overview of some of the main ideas in the book with a special emphasis on the sections on international research. So the talk is titled The Egalitarian Research Imperative and International Research, because the egalitarian research imperative is one of the main ideas in the book. I argue that there is a research imperative, and I'll talk about that in a second. So the agenda for the talk, I'm going to try to put chapter 3 or section 3 about international research into context by talking about the way that justice has been neglected in research ethics, what some of the implications are of the neglect of justice for international research, and then suggest that at least say the ambition of the book is to provide a coherent account of justice in research for both domestic research and international research, for high-income countries, low and middle-income countries, and so avoid the idea that there's a double standard where you have different criteria that are applied in different contexts. It would be the same framework applied in each of these contexts in a coherent way. So part 1 is about fear of connecting the research enterprise to larger social purposes. So for those of you who aren't philosophers, this illustration here comes from Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, and you know, it's a famous illustration because sort of this is the state, but the state, if you can look carefully, what looks like chainmail armor is actually made up of little people. So I choose this as an image because prior to the creation of research regulation in the United States, there was a big debate among researchers and philosophers about the extent to which the state could, demand sacrifices from individuals in the context of biomedical research. So there was a presumption that biomedical research would require, was sort of a zero-sum game, that it would require some sacrifice from individuals. And against the background of that presupposition, which in the book, by the way, I argue is a false presupposition. But against the background of that presupposition, then you had sort of two views. One view was that the state or the collective has a right to medical progress, and that right is strong enough that it would permit the sacrifice of a few unlucky individuals at the altar of scientific progress. On the other side was a view that the state or the collective is not itself threatened by common illnesses or sicknesses or disease. And so the interest in progress in medicine is an optional private goal of individuals, and it's not the interest of the state at all. And so just to give you sort of two illustrative quotes, so you have the famous physician researcher Walsh McDermott, who at a meeting about the changing mores of biomedical research in the United States said, society has rights too. It's preferable that the power to enforce these rights over the rights of the individual be institutionalized. And he argued that very often, in order to ensure that the rights of society are met through biomedical research, you sometimes have to permit an arbitrary judgment to be made against some individuals. So here, this is McDermott arguing that the state should have the authority in the name of social progress to sacrifice the rights and interests of some individuals in biomedical research. In opposition to this, many of you may have read, if you've taken a research ethics class, you may have read Hans Jonas's famous essay where he argues that if cancer, heart disease, or other organic non-contagious ills, especially those tending to strike the old more than the young, if those things were to continue to exact their toll at the normal rate of incidence, including the toll of private anguish and misery, that society can go on flourishing in every way. So Jonas's argument was, because society itself is not threatened, the state has no interest in promoting medical progress. That's a private goal of individuals. And so part of what I then show in the book is that there was some administrative convenience, and then in the wake of historical revelations of abuse, like at the Tuskegee syphilis study that sort of provoked tremendous outrage in the American public, that created the context for Jonas's philosophical position to sort of justify a kind of very pragmatic, but also relatively simple or anemic approach to research ethics that's focused on what I call in the book the IRB triangle. So that the idea here is all these past cases of abuse and in the requests of the idea that researchers ought to be permitted the authority to subordinate the interests of participants to the social good, all of that creates this sort of moral crucible of the potential for abuse of participants at the hands of researchers. And so IRBs, or research ethics committees, get inserted into that relationship to provide oversight. Now, in a certain sense, insofar as that goes, that's fine. Without a social imperative, research is sort of treated now as a socially optional undertaking. It's a private undertaking by private individuals. And so other entities outside the IRB triangle are not usually the primary subject of ethical analysis in research ethics. So I argue that this has an effect on research ethics, that it tends to treat research as a kind of private transaction, that there are really, in general, two main stakeholders, researchers and participants. It centers protectionism and paternalism. It treats research as a kind of functional role that the individual can play You could be a doctor, or you could be a researcher, you could be providing treatment, or you could be carrying out research, as opposed to thinking about research as a social undertaking that requires a diverse division of labor between a lot of people, a lot of different institutions extended over time and connected to important elements of the state. It also disconnects research from larger social institutions, healthcare systems, and their important social purposes. And then it disconnects justice as well from these social institutions and the purposes that they serve, and any connection between the research enterprise and claims of justice that people in a community might have on those institutions. So just to avoid misunderstanding, in chapter 7, I look at the proper role of IRBs, and I argue that IRBs have a really important role to play in the regulation of research, and that the framework that I articulate does a better job of explaining the important work that IRBs actually do. And I argue that that important work is actually resolving a series of coordination problems that plague the unregulated research system, and that because of the way they subject research to prospective review with clearly articulated requirements, that they help to promote social value, but not as much as they could, but indirectly promote social value. And I argue this needs to be strengthened. But they help to ensure that this cooperative enterprise is not co-opted for the private ends of any individual party. That's also imperfect, and that could also be improved, but that's an element of IRB review that I think is important that we should emphasize and strengthen. And also that it helps to provide credible assurance to participants that in participating in research, they're not going to be abused or neglected or dominated. So I do think IRBs have an important role to play, but part of the book is to say that's just a tiny part of a much larger set of issues that research with human subjects raise, and that have been largely neglected. So I focus on international research in the book because I think it's an area that illustrates some of the problems that arise from the background set of assumptions I listed earlier that I think characterize research ethics. So in particular, I think several of the key requirements in prominent documents about international research are quite clearly in those documents grounded in justice. And so I will talk about 3: the responsiveness to host community health needs requirement, the requirement to provide an appropriate standard of care, and then the requirement for post-trial access or reasonable availability. Each of these requirements is frequently grounded in justice, but the value of justice is sort of, John Rawls said it was the first virtue of social institutions, but in research ethics, it's kind of the last virtue of research ethics. It's not well explained, it's not well defined. And so as a result, many of these requirements often appear ungrounded and arbitrary. And I think a key illustration of that, a recent argument by Alan Wertheimer. The idea here is that without a substantive conception of justice, there's a strong tendency to appeal to beneficence and autonomy as a placeholder for justice, or basically to sort of derive the content of what justice requires from these 2 other pillars of research ethics. And I think the recent argument from Wertheimer illustrates some of the problems with that, because Wertheimer says, look, if the worst off would prefer exploitation to neglect, if exploitation makes them better off, then if they would freely and voluntarily agree to be exploited, then preventing mutually beneficial and voluntary agreements works against the interests of the worse off. So he's appealing to autonomy, he's appealing to beneficence. And so he's saying exploitation is morally wrong, but it should be permitted out of respect for the autonomy and the welfare of the worst off. And so that would mean in the international context that if you carry out research that violates all 3 of these requirements, but it still provides a net benefit to the people who are participating in the research, and so they're willing to participate freely, then we should permit that, even if the information that's generated is relevant to other communities. And so my argument here is this argument really exploits the fact that in research ethics has a substantive conception of beneficence and a substantive conception of autonomy, and no real substantive conception of justice. I also argue that long debates over key requirements in international research reflect confusion about the relationship between the research enterprise and key social institutions. So what should the standard of care be? And in the long ago's debates about perinatal HIV research, there was a debate at the very beginning between the global de jure standard of care, basically should we provide the best standard of care available anywhere, where that would rule out research in settings that fall short of global centers of excellence. So it would sort of rule out research that's tailored to the needs of low-income countries. Or should it be the local de facto standard, which is basically whatever participants would receive if no study were being conducted? And the problem with that is it permits the denial of care within a trial, even when that care could be safely and effectively provided in the local context. Because if it's not already provided there, even though it could be, then this standard would say it's not necessary. And there is tremendous debate over these two standards of care. And part of what I argue in the book is that that debate stemmed from the fact that the confusion stemmed from the fact that this debate was carried out without really thinking about the relationship between research and the important institutions in a community. Now let me talk about the egalitarian research imperative and why I think my view, which centers justice, does a better job of filling in these gaps and strengthening the parts of research ethics that are valuable and that work, while expanding the purview of the field in important ways. So philosophically, I think the book makes a novel move in saying, look, when we think about the common good, we shouldn't draw the distinction as between the good of the individual and the good of the collective. When we think about the individual good, we should think about the first order life plan that a person has. You want to be a doctor, you want to be a lawyer, you want to be a good spouse, you want to be a mountain climber. These are all sort of specific plans that you want to achieve and that sort of constitute your flourishing or well-being. And people differ widely in their first order conception of the good. But from a second order standpoint, each of us can realize, well, we have different first order life plans, but we all have a basic interest in being able to formulate and pursue such a life plan. And so from that second level, we can see each other as sharing a set of intellectual and effective and social capabilities we use to do that, and that we have an interest in being able to exercise those capacities in a meaningful way. So that's what now the basic institutions of a just society, they should function to secure the common good, i.e. they should function to secure for people their ability to exercise those basic social and personal and effective capabilities that they need in order to build a life plan and pursue a life plan of their own. And now those basic interests can be threatened by a variety of things, including sickness, injury, and disease. So that's what's relevant to research, but poverty and ignorance and prejudice and animus. And so there are other social institutions that are supposed to address these other threats, but the institutions of biomedical research are supposed to address sickness, injury, and disease. And so I argue research with humans is often the only way to generate the information that we need to bridge the gaps between the ability of individuals to function and the capacity of the health-related social systems in a community to safeguard and support and advance the ability of those individuals to function, and to do that in a way that's effective, efficient, and equitable. So research is often the only way to understand the etiology of disease, disease mechanism, how to prevent it, how to diagnose it, how to manage it, how to treat it. So the first part of the social imperative for which I argue is that the social institutions of a just state need to secure the life, liberty, and welfare of the state's members. That's the point of social institutions. And that fulfilling that function in the face of uncertainty requires knowledge. And in particular, the knowledge relative to health, the knowledge necessary to safeguard health, and the knowledge necessary to make an equitable, efficient, and effective use of scarce resources. And so the resulting imperative is an imperative to conduct research that closes these knowledge gaps so that we can better enable health systems to advance the basic interests of the community members that those institutions serve. But unlike Walsh-McDermott, I argue this way of thinking about the research imperative doesn't license domination, because in a just social order, what basic institutions are supposed to do is secure the common good, i.e. secure each person's basic interests. And we have to think about research not as a social role that the individual takes on, but as a scheme of cooperation that is one element within a larger division of labor. It's extended across time and involves many stakeholders, government entities, private entities, and participants. It calls into action important social institutions on which people in a community have prior claims. And its goal is to generate the information that feeds into those institutions and enables them to fulfill their important social function better. So the second part of the imperative then is that research has to be carried out on terms that respect the status of the individuals that participate in this division of labor as free and equal. And so for participants, that means it should be a voluntary undertaking where participants give their free and informed consent unless they lack the capacity to do so, and then there should be a proxy who can do that. But in a way similar to volunteer firefighters or paramedics, where we ask people to voluntarily take on a role to advance important social purposes. And the goal of prospective review is to eliminate unnecessary risk, ensure an appropriate baseline of care, and prohibit domination and abuse. So all free societies require many social functions to fulfill, important range of social obligations, right? You have to have teachers to educate students. You have to have physicians to minister to health. You have to have researchers to generate new knowledge. You have to have volunteer firefighters to fight fires and so on. And what a just society does is it should shape those roles so that they're attractive to people as an avenue through which they can say, this is part of how I want to get my own fulfillment out of life, but it's also how I want to serve the common good. And I argue in the book then that that's how we should think of research participation, that we need to shape it in a way that it's an attractive opportunity for people to make a contribution to the common good, but secure in the knowledge that they're not going to be dominated or exploited in the process. Now, when it comes to international research then, I argue that these key requirements are necessary to ensure that the local institutions where health research is carried out are strengthened so that they can advance the basic interests of those who rely on them. So the responsiveness requirement is important because it basically says, carry out research someplace, you have an obligation to generate information that will bridge the gaps between the infrastructure in that place and the needs of the community, the members who live in that place. In order to do that, you need to provide a standard of care that goes above the local de facto standard of care, what actually happens, to the local de jure standard of care, where this is, you provide a level of care within the trial that's attainable and sustainable within the infrastructure in that community. So that can be more than what people do currently receive, but it should be a level that's attainable and sustainable, precisely so that you're giving equal treatment to the people inside the trial and the people outside the trial when it comes to implementing the knowledge that you're trying to generate. And then finally, the reasonable availability requirement is grounded in the idea that if you generate the knowledge that's relevant to the healthcare system and the social institutions, of a particular community, no one will get the benefit from that unless it's made available, integrated into the health systems of their community. And so the idea is these are all grounded in this conception of justice, where research is part of an enterprise generating the knowledge necessary for important social institutions to carry out an important social function with respect to the people who live in that community. Okay, so I've reached my 20 minutes and I want to be mindful of the time I have for everybody to get a chance to participate. So I'm going to skip over elements of the book where I talk about equipoise and how to manage risk, and just get right to the end and say thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about this. And now I'm really looking forward to hearing the comments of my colleagues.
Sorry, still muted. Thank you so much, Professor London. Some wonderful insights there, and certainly very novel in terms of a number of these arguments. Let's first hear from the commentators. First of all, we do have Professor Nancy Jecker's recording. Unfortunately, she's not able to be with us at this time because it's really early in the morning in Seattle. So I think that will be extremely difficult for her, but also because of her other commitments. But she has given us a wonderful recording of her views and would love to hear the responses from Professor London later on, and also from Dr. Steele in terms of what you think in terms of Professor Jecker's views. And as you've seen in the very short write-up, Professor Jecker is a professor of bioethics and humanities at the University of Washington School of Medicine and a Fulbright US scholar for South Africa. It might be especially pertinent to us here in Hong Kong to mention that she is an honorary visiting professor at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, which is just across from us on the mainland, actually, if you're not familiar, Alex and Robert. Well, hopefully we will have the opportunity of both of you visiting us in the not too distant future. So fingers crossed in terms of the pandemic situation. So with this, Jane, may I trouble you to share the recording, please?
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Professor Calvin Ho and Professor Alex John London for the opportunity to prepare a commentary on a very important new book, Alex John London's For the Common Good. In this commentary, I touch on the book's negative and positive aims, and I'll indicate briefly whether and why I think certain aspects of them succeed or fail. Overall, however, my message is not one of dissent, but instead calling into question whether the book goes far enough with respect to some of the claims, and also raising concerns about how we ought to get from here to there. So let me begin with the book's negative claims. The book's negative claim is, or negative goal, is to highlight 3 alleged flaws in contemporary research ethics. And this motivates a need for London's new approach. And the alleged flaws are, first, what London dubs the IRB triangle. Second, the so-called fair benefits approach. And lastly, the tendency of research ethics to abstract from social contexts and therefore the power structures in which research occurs. So starting with the IRB triangle, this is the triangle. According to London, this triangle of research ethics frames the moral epicenter of research as falling within the triangle of researchers, participants, and IRBs that regulate the contact between them. The problem with it is that the research triangle leads to a primary focus on regulating contact between researchers and participants, and it leaves stakeholders that fall outside the triangle excluded from primary ethical analysis. And the result is to obscure that research is in fact a cooperative endeavor extended over time involving multiple parties, and its regulation depends on what he calls a strategic environment. I don't think I disagree with the claim, but I would state that, I would state it this way. I would say, while I agree that as a standalone focus, or what London calls the epicenter of research ethics, this triangle is incomplete. But this is not an inherent flaw with research ethics analysis, but a flaw in a way the analysis is sometimes used within the field. So the research triangle is one triangle among many, and the relationships it illuminates are in fact crucial to the research enterprise. Just to sketch out the larger view, for example, take international research. There can be a triangle comprised of researchers in universities, for-profit drug companies, and the World Trade Organization. We're seeing this during the COVID-19 pandemic. The World Trade Organization TRIPS agreement regulates intellectual property and patent rights for vaccines, for example. A triangle also may exist between researchers in universities, host communities, and philanthropical groups and trustees. And I'll say more about this triangle momentarily. Triangle can appear between public funders in the United States, primarily the National Institutes for Health, researchers, and the researchers' A&P committee at their university that determines their promotability and advancement. There can be an important triangle between recruiting agencies like civil society groups, researchers, and the participants in research and their interests. Another example, a triangle between researchers and participants and the university IRB versus the local IRB. So in this configuration, the IRB triangle can still be front and center, or another triangle might be. There's not a flaw with the analysis of the IRB triangle. There's a flaw with the way it is sometimes used as a standalone analysis. A second flaw that London identifies with contemporary research ethics is a flaw with what London calls the fair benefits approach. According to the fair benefits approach, a fair distribution of benefits of research is defined by the results of transactions between researchers and participants, and it exists when those transactions are untainted by force, fraud, or deception. The alleged problems with the fair benefits approach are that first, markets are designed to harness the power of competition, not collaboration. In practice, the view does not avoid entanglements with inequalities of power because those who are equally situated in their capacity to help or harm others receive equal treatment, while those who are less advantaged receive worse treatment. So that entanglement with inequalities of power is there, even when the requirements of fair benefits are met. And lastly, there's a problem for any approach. This is a problem, rather, for any approach that abstracts away from social contexts and the power structures in which research occurs. So I would take this a step further, and let me illustrate one way in which this might be helpful. I think the book's analysis missed an opportunity to address the influence of charitable billionaires on research agendas and the conduct of research and the products of research. So pictured here are a couple of faces that might be familiar to you. This is Mark Zuckerman and his wife, Priscilla Chan, who run a charity empire associated with Facebook that has handed over more than 2.7 billion US dollars. And a critique of this often begins with a concept sometimes called Philanthro Capitalism. And that's a fancy term that's used to describe a simple practice that's now widespread when philanthropic endeavors emulate the way business is done in the for-profit capitalist world. Consider COVAX. COVAX aimed to equitably distribute vaccines during the COVID pandemic, COVID-19 vaccines, yet it did it in a way that kept intact market assumptions by treating vaccines as a commodity sold on global markets at a fair market value, with COVAX one purchaser among many. So the sale of vaccines to COVAX remained under the control of pharmaceutical companies who made profits selling to rich and poor countries alike. From an ethical standpoint, Philanthro Capitalism raises concerns. First, it allows private groups to play an outsized role in global health governance, compromising the independence of organizations like the World Health Organization that are designed to achieve collective goals. In the case of COVAX, the Gates Foundation was the principal funder of the philanthropic organizations, CEPI and Gavi, co-leading COVAX, and the UN's largest single donor. So again, there's a concern with reliance on business people's charity transfers, calling the shots, so to speak. And this can result in a transfer of responsibility for public goods and services from democratic institutions to the wealthy. According to its charter, the World Health Organization is a democratic institution in the sense that it's accountable to its member states, member governments. Yet the Gates Foundation is accountable to no one other than its trustees, pictured here, Bill and Melinda Gates. So such a concentration of power creates an ethical problem for achieving the fair benefits approach. So I'm not sure that the critique that London gives goes far enough. I think this is such a powerful force, the role of international philanthropic organizations like the Gates Foundation, that it needs to be addressed as an outstanding aspect of that shortfall. Third flaw with contemporary research ethics is related. It's abstracting away from larger contexts of social justice. And London raises this as a problem that ignores the larger division of social labor. So I agree, the larger backdrop of structural injustice is the term I would use, becomes invisible. And social processes that exist put certain groups of people under systematic threat of domination or deprivation of the means to develop and exercise their capacities. So without addressing the structural components, this strategic environment is the term that London uses. I agree that abstraction is a distortion. So moving on to London's positive aims. Apologies, I lost some slides here. So moving on to positive aims. His positive aim is to make justice front and center. And this involves putting forth an egalitarian research imperative, underscoring a human development approach and human development goals, and linking just research to broader considerations of social justice in society outside of research. So the alternative that London champions has two aims. First, to promote a research enterprise that bridges gaps between community members' interests and the capacities of social institutions to safeguard those interests and ensure the research enterprise is organized on terms that respect the status of the many stakeholders as free and equal. In the realm of international research, for example, London stresses a duty to promote research that advances development priorities of communities where research is done. And these are the Sustainable Development Goals that probably look familiar to you. London's account, as I see it, is ideal and aspirational, but the question I would pose is, how do we get from here to there? How ought we conduct research in the absence of a just social order, and especially a just global social order? Suppose I am a researcher investigating vaccines for malaria. Who funds me? Who publishes me? Who translates my research into marketable product? Does international research and justice in international research require global justice, a just global social order? That would be a very tall order indeed. So short of that, how do we conduct just research? So some takeaways from these very brief comments, which I hope have served the purpose of pointing in certain directions for further discussion. I think that the negative project largely succeeds, but it may not go far enough. The positive project is ambitious and I think unfinished, which is a double-edged sword. It's incomplete, but at the same time, I think it does the valuable service of pointing to new directions for research ethics. So I want to thank you all very much for your attention, and I'm sorry that I cannot be there live on Zoom to participate in the ensuing discussion of London's book. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Certainly some very instructive insights there from Professor Jecker. So we'd like to record our grateful thanks to her for sharing her views and participating via this recording. So we'll be very happy to update her on some of the discussions following this session. So with this, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our next commentator. He is Dr. Robert Steele, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy and a member of the Medical Humanities faculty at the University of Nebraska. Well, Dr. Steele comes highly recommended from our colleagues at the Department of Bioethics at the US National Institutes of Health. I mentioned this in particular because not to preempt what you're going to say, Robert, it's, of course, our colleagues there have been clear proponents of the fair benefits framework. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on this in response to what Professor London has mentioned in his work. So it's over to you, Dr. Steele. Thank you.
Okay, let me share this. Okay, so hello, everyone. I'd first like to say that I greatly appreciate the book we're here to discuss today, which is an impressive work, which I will surely cite frequently in the years to come. But as has been foreshadowed, that is not to say that I agree with all of it. In fact, I do disagree with a great deal. Nonetheless, in philosophy, criticism is one of the highest forms of flattery, and it's in that spirit then that I aim to flatter in these remarks. So in this commentary, I'm going to be talking mostly about part 3, but part 3 is too large and complex to address as a whole. So instead, I'm just going to focus more narrowly on a few tasks London undertakes. First, criticizing the fair benefits approach to international research ethics. Second, explaining and developing what he calls the human development approach. And third, using that approach to defend the responsivity requirement on international research. So to start off with, what is the responsivity requirement? It requires that international researchers must only run a trial in a community when that trial will produce knowledge which will help meet important needs in the community. It forbids researchers from, for instance, choosing to run a trial in a low-income country solely to exploit the fact that local wages are low and access to care is scarce, yielding a population more willing to agree to burdensome risks, when the researcher's goal is just to turn around and sell whatever they develop exclusively in a rich country context, abandoning the host community and possibly leaving it worse off than they found it. So, as this example suggests, responsivity requirements prohibit some intuitively wrongful behavior. Yet critics do allege that they are overly broad. So consider the example of a sponsor seeking to run a trial in a low-income country, investigating infusions of broadly neutralizing antibodies as long-lasting treatments for HIV. This trial may be beneficial to the host community. It may involve treating a population that is not otherwise accessing treatment, thereby extending the expected length and quality of their lives, while also reducing secondary infections, thereby benefiting the extended community as well. Yet such a trial would not be responsive. While it targets HIV, the knowledge gap it seeks to close is not locally relevant, as infusions of broadly neutralizing antibodies are too expensive and medically complex to be attainable and sustainable in low-income countries. So the thought goes, requiring researchers to not only benefit the communities they interact with, but to benefit them specifically with the knowledge they develop is inefficient, and it wrongfully rules out mutually beneficial exchanges like that trial I just described. So the fair benefits approach holds that while communities must not be exploited or treated unfairly, they ought to be allowed within the range of fair transactions to exercise their own judgment about what benefits they most value. As London points out, though, Defenders of fair benefits views have thus far offered as equivalent what are in fact non-equivalent views on what the fair range consists in. Sometimes they characterize it purely procedurally as whatever would emerge from free informed negotiation. Other times they characterize it substantively in terms of conditions that fair deals should satisfy, such as that greater burdens of participation should also yield greater benefits in return. But London illustrates with some remarks on the theory of auctions that under plausible assumptions about how free and informed negotiations would go, rich country research sponsors would in fact likely capture nearly all the surplus gains from research, while host communities bid each other down in a race to the bottom. In my view, London's contribution here is valuable, and he is entirely correct to press fair benefits types on the fact that there are reasons to believe that whatever would emerge from procedurally free, transparent, but an otherwise unregulated marketed research is likely to conflict with their substantive views on fairness. And it's also correct for him to demand that they either own up to sanctioning a race to the bottom or describe some alternative mechanism that would avoid it. It's less clear to me that we should think this challenge has no answer, though. If the problem is a race to the bottom, then it seems an appropriate solution is regulation that prevents specifically that. For instance, regulators could establish analogs of minimum wage laws, stipulating minimum compensation for participation. Host communities could be allowed to enter into unions or cartels, which collectively fix prices while avoiding the sort of mutual competition that drives a race to the bottom. Surely there are many possible regulations which would adjust the relative share of the gains of research likely to be captured by both parties. So, while London allows that such alternative possible regulatory schemes may exist, he argues that fair benefits types cannot easily appeal to them, because doing so requires abandoning the purely procedural justification that markets express host communities' autonomous choices about compensation. After all, any regulation, in at least some instance, may prevent a community from legitimately asking for what it wants. An assumption underlying this objection seems to be that mixing procedural and substantive motivations is illegitimate. You have to pick one or the other. But I'm not really sure that you do. It seems to me that when it comes to the domestic labor market, many social democrats do think that free and transparent bargaining enhances people's ability to secure the benefits that really matter to them when they're choosing careers and life paths. Yet, nonetheless, those same people are willing to intervene with regulation when confronted with market results that are grossly offensive to their sensibilities. Markets are great and they do enhance freedom procedurally, but if old people are working themselves to death, then perhaps we need a scheme of social security. I mean, if that's at least a coherent attitude, regardless of whether it's ultimately correct, and it's coherent in the domestic context with the domestic labor market, despite mixing procedural and substantive concerns, then it seems to me that a similar stance should be open to defenders of the fair benefits approach when they address international research. So to summarize then, I believe London has pointed out a genuine gap in the fair benefits view, but I'm much less convinced that it can't be filled by anything. So before finishing, I want to raise one more question about the connection between London's own human development view and the responsivity requirement. He takes his view, unlike the fair benefits view, to vindicate this requirement, and the connection, as I understand it, is just this. On London's view, everyone has a duty to bring it about that low-income countries can protect their people's basic interests, and that can't be accomplished without responsive research being done. As London himself notes, though, it would be a non sequitur to infer from just that we should therefore require research to be responsive, because requiring research to be responsive ensures that any research there is responsive. However, it does not ensure that there's any responsive research. Sponsors could respond to requirements like that by simply stopping initiating trials in low-income countries. So we need some positive rather than purely negative effort on this score. For instance, we need the dedication of large public funds from rich countries to support key research initiatives. But once this positive effort to create responsive research is underway, what's the point of retaining the negative restriction against non-responsive research? Why not just do the responsive research and then also allow the non-responsive research to be done too? So London responds to this question by describing very specific ways that non-responsive research can go bad. For instance, London says, look, sponsors conducting non-responsive research may assemble local populations with the aim of conducting quick but scientifically invalid studies aimed at securing rapid approval for their products in their home countries. But everyone agrees that scientifically invalid trials aimed at gaming regulatory systems are bad. And to me, their badness seems to have little to do with responsivity per se. They'd be bad even if they were conducted domestically rather than abroad, and they'd be bad even if they targeted real local knowledge gaps that they would, of course, fail to fill because they are scientifically worthless. He also points out that non-responsive research can siphon off resources from local health systems. But draining resources away from clinical care is also bad in ways that seem to me to have little to do with responsivity per se. First, draining essential health resources is again bad even when done purely in domestic contexts. And second, perhaps more importantly, non-responsive research doesn't need to drain resources. It can also contribute resources. Indeed, investing in local health systems is one way that fair benefits proponents think non-responsive research can nonetheless fairly benefit the communities hosting it. So instead of developing an intervention to use locally, researchers could develop an intervention to be used elsewhere, like in the rich countries they're from, while still building a clinic and training nurses locally. And that would be an important way of benefiting the host community. So while I did emerge from the discussion with a worthwhile appreciation of several ways in which non-responsive research can be bad, I was less convinced that they had to do with its status as non-responsive per se, as opposed to other features that people on many different views, including fair benefits, can say is bad. And I was similarly unconvinced that a responsivity requirement is either necessary or sufficient for addressing those sorts of problems. So I think that does bring me to the end of my time. So I would like to conclude just one last bit by thanking again the audience for listening. It's been wonderful to have you here. And most of all, thanks to London for writing such a rich and interesting book and bringing us all here today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Steele. Now we do have some time to hear responses from Professor London. I'm very keen to hear your thoughts in relation to the wonderful insights that we have gathered from Professor Jecker as well as Dr. Steele. Over to you, Professor London.
Okay, so thank you, Calvin, and also thanks to Drs. Jecker and Steele for, I think it's important what Dr. Steele said, that it's a great honor to have people dedicate their time to thinking about what you've written and then to try to poke holes in it. And we make things better by through this exchange of ideas. So I take that in exactly the spirit that the comments were offered. So let me start with Professor Jecker's comments. So she says that there are other relationships that are important, other sort of research triangles that are important. I fully agree with this. What I would say is that my point is that if you look at the research ethics literature, as a field, we don't do a very good job of focusing on these many other stakeholders who influence the way research is conducted. They influence what questions are asked, how research resources are distributed, how trials are designed, who holds those stakeholders accountable. Very often, when you try to raise these issues, people will say, but those stakeholders don't really fall within the purview of research ethics. Many of the people who look at the FDA and other regulatory agencies in the United States, but in the European Union, the EMA, and so every country has their sort of parallel regulatory institutions that are supposed to ensure safety and quality for medicines. Many of the people who write about those organizations don't view themselves as doing research ethics, and many people in research ethics don't view that literature as falling within the purview of the field. But those decisions of those stakeholders influence how research is conducted in ways that are really critical. So one of the goals of the book is just to highlight that research is this broad cooperative endeavor, and then expand the lists of participants who make it possible so that we can look at the way that their interests and their activities dovetail with or detract from our ability to promote the common good. And also then the book strives to articulate the grounds for holding these private actors accountable for the way that their actions shape research and the way it's conducted. So Professor Jecker's comments are exactly what I hope the book will do, provide a platform for expanding our vision of who these people are who affect research and articulating the grounds for holding them accountable. I fully also agree with Dr. Jecker's comments about the outsized influence of non-democratic institutions that shape the public global health agenda. And I would just say part of the goal of the book there is also provide the framework within which these sorts of critiques can be seen as well-grounded and as falling squarely within the purview of research ethics. Dr. Jecker argues that my view is ideal. That I reject. I don't think the book is ideal unless you think that all considerations of justice, that just talking about justice is somehow ideal. I reject that. Justice is a very practical and important value. And the book argues that there are already issues of justice that are raised in research, that we already take a stand on many of these issues. It's just tacitly and covertly rather than explicitly and overtly. And we let private parties influence issues that affect justice without holding them accountable. And I don't think the view I argue for is idealized or unrealistic. I would say that it simply unfolds the implications of a few basic ideas about the relationship between research, the basic interests of people, and the role of social institutions in safeguarding the basic interests of people. That's a good transition to Dr. Steele's critique. In the book, I argue against pretty vociferously the fair benefits approach. In particular, I think it's a good example of a view that purports to offer a simple, non-ideal way around difficult issues of justice, while ensuring mutual benefit and a fair level of benefit. And I think all these claims are very attractive, but it's a kind of moral Trojan horse in the sense that everybody can see in it what they want to see in it. But I sort of demonstrate in the book that as articulated, it would not function in a way that would establish any of the objectives that its proponents articulate for it. Most importantly, I think that view does embody a tacit view of justice, and it's a problematic view. In particular, it says nothing about the relationship between research and the information that it generates and the social institutions of society that rely on, that people rely on to safeguard their health and their basic interests. So Dr. Steele suggests that we could implement, practices like, an analog to a minimum wage law to promote better benefits to study participants in communities. That might be true, but that wouldn't do anything to ensure a match between the information those studies generate and the priority health needs of communities and the way that their basic social institutions are capable of advancing those basic needs. And the point of my central point of the book is that there needs to be that alignment. It stems from the fact that and I think this is brought out very clearly in the pandemic, individuals in communities rely on social institutions to protect and promote their health. And when those institutions don't have the means of understanding their health needs, of diagnosing them, predicting them, and addressing them, then the welfare of people suffers. And what gets brought out in the pandemic is the clarity of that relationship. And I want to center that and say that's there all the time. All people who are sick and ill rely on health institutions in their community to minister to their needs. And the responsiveness requirement is just grounded in the fact that people in a community have a claim, a prior claim on their social institutions that they do certain things, not that they spend money to put more pockets in private philanthropies or high-income countries, but they spend their resources and organize their behavior to better serve the health needs of the people who rely on them. So that's also my concern about Dr. Steele's last point about permitting non-responsive research. So I do argue in the book that there's probably some peripheral at the margins, non-responsive research that it might be okay to permit. My worry is a very practical, so here, extremely non-ideal, very practical institutional mechanism design economic worry that if you try to set a set of regulations that permit non-ideal research, you create a loophole through which global actors with a very powerful profit motive, they will drive a truck through that loophole and responsive research will sort of fall to the wayside, and powerful private entities will use it to advance their interests without regard for the interests of people in low and middle income countries. And so with that, those are sort of my responses, and I'll turn it back to you, Dr. Ho.
Thank you so much, Professor London. Really helpful responses. Well, since we have the benefit of Dr. Steele's presence, let me invite Dr. Steele to respond if you've got any thoughts to what Professor London has just shared with us. Please, may I also take the opportunity to invite everyone, if you have any comments at all, to either share them in the chat, or otherwise, if you're so inclined, you're welcome to present a question in person. But please do note that an image of you will be captured if your camera is on. And if you don't mind, of course, so will your voice. So thank you so much. Over to you, Dr. Steele.
Yeah, so I think one thing that would be good to note first is, I was in such a hurry to get to the polemics that I didn't emphasize all of the areas of agreement. And I actually strongly agree that the IRB triangle is not the only and maybe not the most interesting thing for research ethicists to think about, and also that we should think about things at a system level and mechanisms and what the mechanisms will accomplish. Great, love it, very on board. I'm still less convinced, though, that responsiveness requirements are a mechanism that we need, and that there can't be other mechanisms that, as mechanisms, are better. So in your last remark, you were concerned that non-responsive research is going to be like a loophole that international sponsors drive a truck through in pursuit of their own private aims and enrichment. But I would say that if research is really functioning as part of a just social order, that order can align their private interests with the social good as well. So like, yeah, a researcher who wants to develop broadly neutralizing antibodies as like a once every 6 months treatment for HIV wants to make money doing that, and they're trying to develop it for that reason. And so that may be their motive. Nonetheless, when it gets developed, it's a great thing for people with HIV in high income countries that can afford it. And what's the harm to the low income country that's hosting the research? Well, if they get a bunch of people treated for a while, and maybe they also get nurses trained and clinics built, or whatever other sorts of payment / compensation we want to imagine in that place, it just seems like, yeah, the mechanism of allowing that non-responsive research kind of made everyone better off. So I still don't see the connection between responsivity requirements per se and a better strategic or institutional landscape.
Thank you so much, Dr. Steele. Really helpful. Let me just check back with the audience if anyone has got any questions at all. Well, if not, I mean, it would be wonderful to hear a further response from Professor London. In fact, if I may, I'm quite curious to hear about your thoughts, Professor London, in terms of how you'd see your particular approach as being applicable if local social institutions are dysfunctional. So we see that during the outbreak of Ebola in West Africa. So in that sort of situation, would the default be to rely on what Professor Jecker has mentioned as global institutions like the World Health Organization, but then would run into the trouble of an absently just global social order as we hope would have. So I'm curious as to your thoughts in terms of this. I think very pertinent, given that we again have, quite unfortunately, reports of outbreaks of Ebola in Congo. So hopefully contained, but it really is hard to say. A more recent report suggests that we should expect more of, quite unfortunately, these sort of outbreaks in the foreseeable future. So over to you, Professor London.
Great. Okay. So thank you. Let me take your question first, Dr. Ho, because I think that's it's a really good one. What if local social institutions are dysfunctional? So part of the human development approach that's articulated in the book is to say, look, to answer that question, we have to stand back and say, what is it that basic social institutions are supposed to do? And then next question is, what's the best way to enable them to fulfill that role? So part of this then is very often what people will have a right to or claim on their institutions to is not participation in novel research that will benefit high-income countries, but better access to established effective means of addressing the health needs that are priorities in those communities. So I want to make sure that that's clear, that there may be cases where what people have primary claim to is strengthening of their local healthcare systems and access to the things we already know work. That's an important requirement. Now, the case of Ebola is really important because we didn't have an arsenal of established effective vaccines or treatments. And so that's where you can see the value of global partnerships that have to come in and strengthen those health systems. That epidemic and the current pandemic show the value of sentinel systems that are monitoring for infectious disease, being able to sort of build that infrastructure. And the importance of being able to learn. And I'd say, this is a case where the outbreak was happening in a particular place. The people in that place had the interest of generating the knowledge to close the gap between the institutions they rely on and their health needs, and global research that, was sort of global partners who came in to carry out that research to generate, to test novel vaccine candidates and therapeutics. I would say that's an important illustration of the value of research for closing those sorts of gaps and the importance of responsiveness, right? Like that research was important because it was responsive to those needs, and vaccines that were generated in the conduct of that have been made available in that place. And that's an important way that circuit, gets closed. I think if to pivot now to what Dr. Steele, had sort of said in his response, he sort of said, if research is already part of a just social order, then, and I would say, look, that's the rub right there. We live in, and so this is the sense in which I take my work to also be addressing the non-ideal circumstances of the world in which we live. We do not currently have research that's as part of a function of a just social order. The book is trying to articulate the criteria in which research would be part of and support a just social order. And so the Ebola experience is a good example where there might be lots of institutions that are missing. We could say that many parts of the social order there are not just, but can we conduct research in a way that contributes to and strengthens institutions that on which people have claims of justice? If we permit and then I would say it's Dr. Steele's claims who are sort of highly idealized, because the idea now is if we have a kind of free market in research, perhaps now we can have it so that everybody benefits. We carry out research and local participants benefit, high income countries benefit. And my worry there is, if you only focus on those local stakeholders, they benefit. But what about the other people in low and middle income populations that say, here are our priority health needs? They're being neglected because much more powerful parties are able to set the research agenda, and they want to carry out their research here because they can do it more quickly at lower cost and more effectively, but they're exporting the knowledge, they're extracting the knowledge to go back and strengthen their healthcare systems. And I think ultimately then the cumulative effect of that is, you get a few people who benefit locally, but you don't strengthen the local healthcare infrastructure of that population. And the people in that community have a claim that those social institutions and their population minister to their needs. So in order to have justice be part of a more just social order, I think the responsive requirement is important, because wherever research is conducted, and I think the Ebola case is a good one, all those parties could see themselves as partners in inquiry to generate knowledge that's going to be useful to every partner in that division of labor. And the responsiveness requirement was helpful for making that the case, because if we generated those vaccines and then we only gave them to people in high income countries, that would have been a huge problem, right? That knowledge wouldn't have benefited the people who are suffering from the effects of that disease most directly. So I hope I didn't go on too long, but I hope that's a response to both of your really valuable and insightful comments.
I think that's great. Thank you so much, Professor London, really helpful. But I just wonder, if I may, just very quickly, how your approach could help us understand possibly the translation of partnership to capabilities. So I ask because we have got international partners who may be involved in a particular local situation, responding to more immediate needs. But then there would be longer term kind of needs, isn't it? So I'm thinking of course, some of the activities that MSF is involved in, a lot of its work in Africa. It's meant to be a humanitarian organization, as you know, to support short-term kind of needs. But then you see them actually staying on for much longer because there just isn't any kind of local institution coming up. But they're not capacitated to do long-term work because they're not set up for these kind of purposes. Although they're also still engaged in research. So I see no easy solution to that. And I just wonder whether your work could help perhaps to point the way forward in this dilemma. Thanks very much.
Great. Yeah, that's also a great question. I think rather than trying to sort of, let me just say how I think what I'm trying to do in the book is relevant to this. I think we are hampered in addressing complex problems like the one that you describe by only focusing on a very narrow sort of set of stakeholders and a very narrow dynamic within that problem, rather than being able to sort of situate the larger problem in a larger context. And so, you know, there's debate among development economists and the people who study development about how to promote the kind of institutions in every community, right? Every community struggles with ensuring that their institutions are more efficient, more effective, and how do we build the capacity of those institutions? We have those same issues, and they're amplified and magnified in lower income settings. And of course, then you can have the circumstance in which humanitarian organizations that try to augment those capacities wind up sort of taking on and fulfilling roles that really ought to be fulfilled by the local government. And so I think I don't have a blueprint for solving those problems. I would say that what I'm trying to articulate is a framework within which saying, step one is identifying all the relevant stakeholders and then trying to hold them accountable. And if all you do is focus on researchers and the way that they interact with a bunch of unnamed stakeholders, that's like trying to push toothpaste back into the tube. You have no leverage. You're not looking at the incentives that the various powerful parties have to do what they do. And if the step one is expanding the list of stakeholders so you understand who's involved, what their incentives are, and then trying to lobby the very powerful parties and hold them accountable for the way that they shape, that environment. So I'd say the book's not a recipe. It would be incredible if the book could sort of solve all these various difficult problems. But I think providing a framework within which to say, it would be an error if we didn't hold certain people accountable for these things. And there are a lot of people right now in research ethics where we don't hold them accountable for the way that what they do shapes the research agenda. A conversation we often don't have is what research ought to be done that's not being done. How do we help communities articulate? Many communities have not articulated what their priority health needs for medical research would be. I think there is diversity in the way that people can go about doing that, but there'd be real social value in promoting, and there are organizations that are trying to do this. But I think having greater clarity about what are the priority research needs that we have, and then being able to say, hey, if you're carrying out research in these places, what are you doing to advance those needs? That would be an incremental advance over the status quo. And I'm happy to sort of, try to move in incrementally better ways rather than trying to say we must sort of have a just social order now. Although having said that, the time for justice is now. I mean, I don't like the idea that you say to people, well, you need to wait for justice until very powerful parties, find it in their interest to meet the legitimate claims that you have on your social institutions.
Thank you so much, Professor London. I think that we are all with you, that the time for justice is now and should not be delayed. Final call for questions from anyone from the audience. I do appreciate that it is a Friday night here, so that might be in part the reason. Any last words from Dr. Steele?
Thank you again for writing such a great book, and to all of you for hosting and for joining us here tonight to talk about it.
Thank you so much. And I also take this opportunity to thank well, Dr. Steele, first of all, and Professor Jecker for being wonderful commentators. And of course, Professor London for writing this seminar work. It's a great addition to the literature, all the rich debate that we are already seeing in research ethics, and highlighting where we fall short in serving justice. And there is really a great need for this, as the pandemic has made very clear in just about every health system in the world. So finally, of course, a note of thanks to all of the participants. Very grateful for your attention, for being with us. It is late in the night, actually, here in this part of the world. But if you do have any questions at all, we are very much in contact with Professor London. So do feel free to share your thoughts, your reactions, your questions with us, and we'll be happy to relay them to Professor London. And of course, at some point, we hope to invite Professor London and Dr. Steele to this part of the world. I think it'll be much better when we're all in the same time zone. It's always a struggle when there is more than 12 hours between us. So thank you again. It is going to be a long weekend for everyone in Hong Kong. So have a very pleasant break and with a lot of sunshine. At least that's the forecast. Or maybe there might be some rain. Well, but still, I think some rain might be good. So with this, thank you again. Have a very restful night for everyone here in Hong Kong, and a great day ahead, Professor London and Dr. Steele in North America, or in whichever part of the world that you may be in, for all our participants. Thank you. Do stay in touch. Bye for now.